From time to time, it feels like the world itself is falling apart. We observe this idea that the West is collapsing. In fact, I have an entire section of my bookshelf dedicated to books exactly on this subject, ranging from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which provides some sort of mythical narrative of a way to escape from the collapse around it for those who desire to live in consistency with their values, to nonfiction, including How You Can Find Happiness During the Collapse of Western Civilization by Ringer, and The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see me look off to the side to try to figure out exactly how many I need to account for. But there have been many novels on the subject: 1984, Animal Farm, and then you have Brave New World. These ideas, these books, this concept has been written about for much longer than most of us have been alive, and yet we still hear its echoes playing in our day. If you grew up in any format of the conservative side of America, you've been hearing this narrative over and over and over again: make America great again, or this idea that America has collapsed or is falling apart is being picked apart by ravens and knaves and fools. There's also the element that's presented within the church, that if only America returned to its Christian roots, would we continue to be that shining beacon on the hill. And the issue here, the problem that's presented, is that there is this idea that there was a country that was good, and it is no longer that way. Or there was an institution, there was a time when this institution was beautiful, it was full of life and vigor and learning, but now it has fallen apart. And there's no shortage of evidence here. But you will know that this channel and what we talk about and what I talk about frequently on this show is the anti-nihilistic worldview. I'm not alone in this piece, in this idea, but we need to go and give first the devil its due. The idea that the West is falling apart certainly isn't lacking in evidence. We have mass importation of individuals who do not share our worldview. We have the education system, which fails to pass on our values to the next generation, tied hand in hand with parents who refuse to uphold that responsibility. We have books and literacy falling apart as the mass generations that follow the internet barely can read enough to get through a children's book. And yet, we also see those who are hailed from the heights of institutions like Harvard and Yale produce the kinds of literature which a illiterate knave wouldn't even consider respectable. Institutions are being corrupted, whether they are governments or they are colleges, not by some maniacal emperor whose wit and power we could at least respect, but rather by this borderline collection, or this borderline illiterate collection of mockers of intellect. In fact, the people who run the institution are not just those who should be institutionalized in this sort of metaphor that the crazies are running the crazy house, whatever the metaphor or the phrase is, but it rather, the people who have been elected into seats of authority are the exact antithesis of the values that that institution are supposed to promote. The people who are making decisions at the top of your academies seem to be, or at least feel like, oftentimes these people who not only are in opposition to the values that that institution is supposed to promote, but rather have made it their life's work not to revolutionize and reform an organization that may have gone astray, but rather to revel in its destruction. In fact, we have even this idea of culture being corrupted by the anti-culture, where communities that have maybe rich history woven in between decades and generations and families have decided to adopt the Marxist worldview, which is the anti-culture itself, the destruction of anything substantial and meaningful for the sake of a temporary bliss of resentment. The old ways all are evil, and the old ways all must be uprooted for the sake of our continual, eternal self degradation. Even Plato's cave is twisted by knaves to become traps for fools. If I'm going to quote a small section from If by Rudyard Kipling, and the idea that Plato's cave is wielded like a cudgel by people who haven't even considered reading his work because it must be patriarchal if it was written by a man. And then you have the argumentation against religion and faith. Again, we are giving the devil its due. Our economic system is run by people whose goal, our economic system is run by the bank robbers. Our political system is run by the dishonest. Our intellectual system is run by those lacking intellectual integrity. All the way down, you can complain and complain and complain about how the world is falling apart. Certainly our military's generals are not the esteemed warriors that we would expect of our generation. It's not like special operations troops are the people who rise through the ranks through years of dedicated work to find themselves sitting in the office directing missions. No, rather, the politically advantageous charity hire is the person who ends up getting the seat in JSOC because they need to get their ESG points for their congressional values. And we are not even beginning to scratch the surface of how much is going wrong in the world. Homes decay, families fall apart, communities collapse under the weight of their strain of emotional distress. We see gun culture rip itself apart with controversy after controversy after controversy. This man stealing this idea from that company, this individual changing his persona to take on a nihilistic worldview. This man turning out to be a Fed trying to entrap his neighbor. Business selling out business for the sake of making a quick buck. We have it happening across communities where churches split over negligent concerns, whether it's because a man does not want to be a man anymore. Well, that's not even a negligent concern. That's probably one of the closest ones. Rather, you have syncretism, this idea that you can take one part of church and the religious truth that's baked into it and one part culture and put those two in a melting pot, stir it together, and get something amalgamous of the two. Rather, that short-sighted worldview paints both of them as different ingredients in a whole, when really we're looking at two fundamental different worldviews. And so the world itself, the institutions like Yale, Harvard, Princeton look like they're falling apart. The institutions like the military, special operations, Ranger Battalion, Navy SEALs, pick what you want. It doesn't matter where you go, you can find evidence that things are falling apart. Even our personal homes and our personal lives must contend with age. We cannot just sit and let our house abide. We must put constant work and maintenance into the physical structure, lest nature reclaim it for something else. And the world can feel dark at times because nothing, it seems, that we create is permanent. There is nothing that mankind has produced which seems to last perpetually through the ages without falling apart to dust and decay or being corrupted by mankind. There is no good intention and good institution that is invented by mankind which isn't later corrupted and twisted to use against its own people. The good ideas that government presents are oftentimes twisted by the next generation to be used as a weapon against our own population. Even the wealth of men who have spent their lives, dedicated their lives to providing for their families, pass on that generational wealth to the next one and even to the next, who squander it to create more and more destruction in their wake. And yet we have to ask this question: why is it, or what is it about mankind which avoids or resists being permanent? What do we mean by permanence? Even mankind's ideas or abstract objects are corrupted over time. What is this idea of permanence that we're talking about, and why is it a good thing that mankind cannot achieve it? Enter the title card. The world is temporary, and that's a good thing. The world that we live in is not permanent. Nothing mankind makes is permanent. You cannot create an institution impervious to human corruption. Communists will always find a way. Mankind will always fall to corruption, or at least its institutions. So then we must ask the question, what is permanent? What is it that exists across the entire line of human history that was there at the beginning and will be there at the end? What is it that we are talking about when we think about this idea of permanence across millennia and generations and the rise and fall of empires? Languages change. We can't choose that. Ideas change. We can't choose that necessarily. This idea that cultures change, they adapt, they develop, they corrupt, they collapse. This is something. Even our great cathedrals, our buildings that have lasted thousands of years, will eventually be destroyed by either moth and rust or thieves who break in and steal. But still, each generation is faced with its opportunity to maintain that which they've been given. Each generation then is offered the opportunity to participate in humankind. For let's just say, if we could produce some sort of thing that was permanent, then every generation born after that one would be robbed of the opportunity of discovering its creation. Rather, every generation now, every man in his day, every person in his age is faced with the opportunity to either maintain something good within his environment or to allow it to collapse under darkness. This is why you cannot get rid of ideologies like communism, or you cannot get rid of the resentment of mankind. You can only oppose it. You cannot get rid or end war without creating a totalitarian state that uses war as its threat to avoid war in this sort of juxtaposition. Rather, we live in this world where nothing that mankind can make is permanent. And there's a good thing about that. If it were permanent, people would have nothing to work towards. And then they would only, as Carl Jung says, break the perfect environment, the utopia that we've created. This idea that mankind desires some sort of perfection, it might actually be baked within our system. It might be built within our being by our creator. It is it was Calvin who talked about this idea of the sensus divinitatis, that mankind has this desire for something greater than itself, something more permanent than his ability to create, that he can orient his life towards, and he can dedicate something to. And that is what we worship. In fact, all mankind worships something, and what we place at the top of that hierarchy of values is functionally our God. It turns out there is no such thing as somebody who isn't religious. There is no spectrum of religiosity. It simply turns into a question of, what is it that you put your faith in? What is the permanent outcome you hope for? Is it oblivion, annihilation? Are you a nihilist that seeks the only permanence is destruction? Or is there something or someone whose higher power is worthy of your worship? The problem with permanence that mankind has, and perhaps the blessing that comes inside that negativity, is that if mankind could create anything that was permanent, where would they be able to create something? Or if they were to be able to create something permanent, would that and since mankind is tinged with a semblance of wickedness, even if what we created was 99% good but 1% evil, whatever that thing that was made, which was made permanent, would thus make that 1% which is evil also permanent. Let's just say you created a system of law, a system of governance that was so perfect, so correctly tailored to the human condition, but had one fatal flaw. If you made it permanent, not only would you make the institution permanent with all its good parts, but you would also be making permanent that one evil component. And any man with a modicum of humility recognizes that there's nothing that mankind can produce that is beyond perfection. There's nothing that mankind can produce that is absolutely perfect in every single way. It can only achieve at best a 99% action. Everything can be improved on in a little way, but that improvement continues to scale almost infinitely towards the divine, but never achieving it. And we should be thankful once again that even if this institution, this idea of something that or anything of man could be made permanent, we should be thankful that it is not the case, because once being made permanent, in order to be defined as permanent, it would require that there is nothing mankind could do to change it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be permanent. Let's talk about the idea of a government. So we have this idea that a government, or if a government could be made permanent, something like the Second Amendment, even, then there would be no opportunity to change it in the future. We might think that's good in one sense, but remember, there's always something baked into humanity, which includes an opportunity for evil. That includes an opportunity for evil. It includes the fallen nature of mankind. In fact, we might go back to the book of Genesis, where immediately after eating from the tree of good, of the knowledge of good and evil, one of the first actions that God took or made after Adam and Eve's first sin was to find a way, or to not find, he wasn't discovering, God is all omniscient, but to cut off mankind from the tree of life. And the tree of life itself is a bit of a mystery for much of mankind, because it is seemingly both a metaphor, a type, or a symbol that points towards something to come later in the story. It also seems to have an efficacious attribute to it, which could produce some semblance of immortality in mankind. Immortality being a concept that we can't really wrap our finite minds around. I mean, even mankind cannot perfectly understand infinity, and so we cannot understand permanence, something that would exist beyond our timeline. So we know that mankind cannot produce permanence, but what does? What is? By our inability to produce something permanent, mankind has been made able to understand one element of the glory of God, that even the simplest creation of God is more permanent, more fundamental, more closer to the building blocks of reality, which ultimately result in being God himself. The building, well, not, let's not become a panentheist here, but you get what I'm saying, in a divine compositional sort of way, which means that the very act of creation, the very existence of this physical world, is the result of God's continual act of creation. He upholds the physical world through his will. The only thing more permanent than existence itself is the permanence of the creator of existence. Our finite worldview is contained within this world that we have been created in, but there is something outside of it greater than that creation, which has a sense of permanence that wrestles beyond our comprehension. The idea then that we are going to argue on even grounds with this being, this creator, that we could wrestle with him in a way as which to say that we could make judgments against him, is the folly of mankind. We may wrestle with God to try to understand him better, just like a man will wrestle with ideas to try to comprehend them. It is not that he is wrestling with them out of disrespect, but out of a desire to understand them more personally. Faith can become an action of wrestling. It can become an experience of difficulty, where you look into the abyss, and you prepare for it to look back at you. But that is where the moment of wisdom can begin. To accept one's finite nature and one's humanity is only this first step. But if you stay there for the rest of your life, you are embracing a new kind of hubris. That your short witted perception could go so far as to perceive all of creation and thus condemn it all because you can't see the point. You have missed your place in the universal cosmos. It is not our job to comprehend of all of reality. It is our job to figure out its source and worship it. And so we have something to be thankful for, that we are not permanent, but God is permanent. And what is the source of permanence is, if the source of that which is good is permanent, then we know that good can be permanent. This idea that good and evil is not black and white, but a scale of gray, is a mistaken a mistaken understanding of the world that we live in. Whether you are arguing jus ad bellum or jus in bello, we must understand that that grayness that we experience in the world is actually a result of our finite ability to perceive. In fact, it is the hubris of man which says, I can only see gray, therefore it is gray, when in reality, outside of his perception, the world is in fact a distinct black and white. Through this understanding, we can understand and we can approach this idea of humility, that if left simply as a unwillingness to commit to principles, should not be considered humble at all. Let me restate. By understanding that the world consists or is organized into good and evil, but we, by our finitude, can only see in shades of gray, and our lack of perfect eyesight tends to blend those things together, it is not the world which we condemn. It is not the creation which we throw out. It is not the world of the Gnostics that we embrace. We do not say that everything is upside down because it is upside down. We recognize that the upside down nature of the world is simply because we are the actors within it. And then our humility of recognizing that there is some source of black and white, but we, being reduced in our vision to only seeing scale or shades of gray, are then responsible to navigate that gray to try to find and get closer to the source of the black and the white. The thing which divines black from white, discerns good from evil. It is our job to perceive and to seek after that. And that is where humility can be found. Hubris is thinking that we are the diviners of the black and the white, the good and the evil. Or hubris is saying that we are completely incapable of perceiving it. Or hubris is saying that our perception is what creates the black and the white, not the source of permanence outside of ourselves. And so, through this, we can gain a semblance of hope. If the world outside your door, it looks like one of ruin and collapse, or the world inside your heart is one collapsing under the weight of its own inconsistencies, this is the reality that we live in. Your observation is not incorrect. It may, however, be masturbatory. Are you basking in the pleasure of observing the collapse of the world? Are you doing so even in a masochistic way, where you wear the face of a frown and the face of fear, but in your heart of hearts, when you look deep, are you seeing only the results of the things that you want to take place? Is actually the collapse of Western civilization not something that you would want to prevent, but something that you want to encourage? Because if society collapses, then you are not responsible for your actions in a cultural norm sense. Are we fooling ourselves when we talk about these things? Or are we hoping to fool one another, thinking that our phrase, heaven forbid, is just code word for maybe one day? I don't mean to be so crass about this. I think there is a certain responsibility that we carry. And then, in fact, not only do I think it, I am imploring you to understand that if you are going to become a person worthy of respect, part of that is being capable of violence, capable of encouragement, capable of not only development, but destruction as well. And that capability is one that you must harness, control, contain, respect, and wield appropriately. And if we are, and I believe that that which invites us and informs us to participate in things like the military or gun culture or police work or self defense is actually a deep seated virtue that is built into our being. We recognize that we bear some responsibility to living in this world, that we can't just live around with some sort of main character syndrome, but also that we have a responsibility to those around us. And part of that responsibility is to be aware that evil is out there and preying on ourselves and the innocent and the guilty alike, but also that it is our responsibility as thinking men to use our mind, our intellect, and our abilities to function in our world. It is sinful, perhaps negligent in its sense, to let the institutions simply collapse under your watch. There is a shame to it. There is a sense of guilt to allow the knaves and the fools and the raptors come in and rip apart the things that we have created in order to produce a just and good society. It's not so simple to say that we just go out on crusade and crush everything in our wake. We know that that solution is not a solution at all, but another peg in the board of going back and forth between vengeance to vengeance to vengeance. Rather, it is our responsibility, whether in our homes, our workplaces, our institutions, our academies, our governments, to promote, produce, and to provide guidance and direction for that which is right, seeking first where we find our conviction, not only in ourselves, but in the source of that which is permanent. If we are to be calling ourselves men of valor, then we must be worthy of the honor that we desire. If we want to be part of a community of men that hold us to a standard, we cannot shy away from the idea of there being standards set between us. If we are going to call ourselves the West and we are going to hold Western values, that implies that we must investigate, understand, dignify, edify, and desire to know what those values are. When we assume them, we set ourselves up for charlatans to come into our midst and convince us that our values are something other than that which is right and true and good. We allow our children to be convinced by fools that we live in an oppressor oppressive society or an oppressor oppressed society, or the world is easily broken apart into a simple worldview of evil or oppressors and oppressed, which is a hilariously hubristic attempt to rob the world of good and evil and simply reduce it into those guys over there. If you've seen the movie The Creator, you know what I'm talking about. It seems like the bad guys don't even have the caricaturistic attitudes by which they should be directed by. Rather, it's like this simple, peaceful, hippie, go lucky, good people versus the evil empire, which is also incompetent at the same time. It's a knockoff Star Wars, but fine, let's move on. The argument that we see in our world that we are presented with is in the oppressor oppressed narrative is a robbing of and replacing of the source of permanence with our own perception. So, what do we do going forward? What does this mean? When you see the world around you collapsing, there is one thing to be concerned about and one thing to be thankful for. The concern should be, am I responsible for this collapse? The thing to be thankful for is, by understanding that there is collapse and breakdown, decay in this world, we can recognize the eternal glory of that which is called the Alpha and the Omega. If we want to seek after a semblance of permanence, if you're wondering why the world is falling apart around you, and it seems like everything that man produces is doomed to fail, whether in the short term or in the long term, your observation is not incorrect. But the question that you should be asking is, what is your solution? What is the alternative? If mankind cannot produce utopia, where is the source of the good? And with that question, I leave you. For today's episode of the Redacted Culture Cast is supposed to be not only a idea and an acknowledgement that the world out there is dark and full of terrors. To quote, I'm pretty sure that's like Game of Thrones. But the world outside is dark and full of terrors. But there is a source of hope. And the question is, are you pursuing it or are you lying to it? This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. We are on episode 148. And if you are still listening to us, we thank you for your time. If you want to share this episode with your friends, that is the way that we are going to grow right now. We are at that early stage, even though we've been around for a little while. Our goal here, my goal as the host of the Redacted Culture Cast, is to participate in the conversations to bring you the information about not only gun culture, but Americana, which is sitting at our hearts. What is it that we value? What are the intellectual tools that we need to continue going forward? Self-defense is this idea that we want to promote or we have enshrined into our Constitution, but we have somehow neglected as a society the very intellectual foundations of this right. You can say that you have the right to bear arms, but on what grounds? Do you even know? Or is it just because my Second Amendment? We believe that there is value in deeper understanding, and so we are bringing that, the fusion of gun culture and philosophy, the idea of integrating not only why we do what we do, but how we come to understand it. If you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com and support us there on Locals. Again, that's redactedculture.locals.com. That is also where we host conversations. If you want to get a hold of me and you want to get into a long form conversation behind the censors at YouTube, that's the way to do it. Also, you can pick up our merch at redactedllc.com to join our intellectual army that is taking this country by storm. That being the case, go forth and conquer.